Hello, Henrik Knudsen here. I would like to present my comments on this screencast, and it concerns an article by David Thies, Business Models, Business Strategy and Innovation, in the Long Range Planning. A rather old 2010, but it has many elements that I find interesting and relevant to reflect on and include in our modern day understanding of business models. It doesn't quite address as many business model elements, but what it does instead, it gives a great understanding of the importance of business models, what they are, and how they can be used. It also excels by having a great number of business model cases that can be interesting to reflect on when assessing the concept of business models. And last but not least, some of the cases are outdated. For example, there are some examples with Netflix, which has changed dramatically since Thies published this article in 2010. In this context, it's interesting for you and I to reflect on how dynamic the past years has been in the business model development, business plans of some of the cases mentioned, i.e., in this case, Netflix. With no further ado, let's move on, and I'll comment as I see some of the aspects. And finally, feel free to send your questions and comments to me, and in that way we can start a better knowledge sharing community. Let's contribute to it. The first place to start could be, what is the understanding, what is the definition of a business model? And I found it quite well caught here, and it's the design of the value creation in a company. So what is it? How does it deliver it? How does it capture it? Which mechanisms does it employ? So which mechanisms does an organization employ in its value creation and delivery? Moving further down, we find that Thies mentions that the supply side driven logic of the industrial area has become no longer viable. I agree that due to the internet, there's a greater transparency, but the supply side is still viable in all the different industries that have a technological push or a design push. I would say that quite a lot, just take the iPhone, was a technological and a design driven supply side push. So it's not always the market has grown greatly more transparent, but this doesn't mean the organizations do not have the other option. There is another interesting comment up here. It says that business therefore need to be more and more customer centric. I very much agree. So we have to tailor our communication. The organizations must tailor their marketing directly towards much more the individual consumer, which could actually raise the point, is the whole logic of segmentation, is it being relieved or surpassed by a segmentation characterized by the individual? It's a question worth considering. So let's move on and find out what a business model is. In essence, a business model is a conceptual rather than a financial business model. Because when it gets specific, the business model being specific becomes a business plan. This is well written here, where a business model may well become embedded in a business plan, i.e. a business model being the generic part and the business plan being very specific to an organization. Then we have this interesting part here where they're finding determine the benefits the customer from consumer, the benefits for their customers. And this is very interesting and relevant, saying, well, what is it actually the customer perceived value? What is it customers would like? What is it the customer perceives as value creating? And be quite clear that this is not necessarily the same as the value proposition, because what the organization is proposing is their value proposition as they see it. But this might not be the value that the customers perceive. So we have to be very clear when we're talking about value proposition, i.e. coming from the company, and customer perceived value, looking at the same product or service but from the customer's point of view. Another interesting point down here is that we from the value you create to the customers, entice payment and convert payments to profits. This is also relevant because it might not be the customer or the user that is paying. Google being an excellent example. I think many of you use Google, but not very many have actually made a contribution directly to the Google account. And let's face it, Google is quite a well-off, quite a rich, quite an affluent organization. So you're not paying them. Where does their money come from? Again, the users might not be the ones that are paying. So it's important to entice them payment and then convert payments into profits. The next slide here, we're now moving on to page 175. And what I note here is that this context, the customer will buy if the price is less, the utility yield, and this part here is absolutely old school, although it's still very much alive in the books and the literature about business development, business strategies, economics of business. So this is what's keeping a lid on the development of business models and business plans, is that existing literature has its paradigms and ways of thinking it that we must surpass in some way. Let's move on to the next page, 176, and see what this is an example of a business with a paradigm. As the different disciplines, academic disciplines have their paradigms, this is a great example of a paradigm that this consumer had a resistance in the start to meat slaughtered days before in distant place. That was the case then, but it's no longer the case, as we have surpassed this paradigm of meat having to be slaughtered on location and preferably on the same day. On the contrary, the next part is trying to have a look at IPR rights, and this I find this one interesting, whereas Sealand initially made their patents available royalty-free to the international standards organizations. They had developed what was commonly known as a container transport, but they knew it had to be used by a lot of people or industries for it to be truly advantageous for them. So they made it accessible for everybody, so everybody started using the same type of container. Otherwise it would have been this type of container, height, width, depth, etc. different, or this would make storage and the benefits of using them would have been much less. There's an interesting example of patents being made public, which was the advantage for the company publicizing it. The next one is an interesting example of how to make money, another way to make money, which is a razor blade model. Selling the razors very cheap, underpriced practically, and then overpricing something else that is necessary, important for the total value proposition, i.e. the razors. As we, for example, see in the case with printers. The printer itself is quite cheap, but when you have to buy the refill for the printer, it's just about the same expense as the initial printer that you bought. So again, the first one making patents accessible for all, and this one is a way of making money. And this article is very good at coming with different examples of how they cash in. The next thing I would like to draw your attention to is this comment in this sentence here with relationships, where with the case above, relationships is extremely important. I think that's one of the benefits of the business model cube, that is very explicit about relationships. You may have some contacts, but if you don't have the nitty-gritty, the more intimate, more understanding relationship, then the contacts are not worthwhile. So the depth or the intensity of the relationship is very important. Another next interesting example is the case down here when with the music video, and this is this was then the New Kid Around the Block, whereas the New Kid Around the Block, since this was written, is Spotify. So read it and refer it to Spotify as we know it now. And moving on to the next part, which tells us that And the next part is this with introduction of Netflix, and this is really, it's smiling to read and follow through. There's some examples in the next part also concerning Netflix. Interesting due to the fact that we know how Netflix has developed since 2010 until 2017. So read it through and keep it considering or reflecting on how the business model has changed in this paper and since this paper was written. The next part is then with give your service away for free. And this is very important in the internet age, because first it's digitalized. The amount of consumers, users, customers is irrelevant whether it's 1,000 or 100,000. The extra expense in making it accessible to 100,000 is not very great compared to making it accessible to 1,000. So how can you use this greater accessibility and in return get the user, the customer, or some third party to pay for this access or this value proposition? Very important perspective. Then let's move on to Google being addressed on page 181. And I should get there just in a minute. Yes, here we are. With the Google example here. And this, I think, should also be added on with the aspect of Google AdWords. Google AdWords, great, huge stream of income for Google. And if you're not familiar with the way Google AdWords works and the prices, have a look and test and see how you actually, by paying, can get a. It's not who uses it most, but you can pay to get further up in the hierarchy of the link suggested. Whoops, soon gone 15 minutes. We only have 15 minutes per screencast, so I'll continue on for the next screencast.